Good afternoon, everybody, and Happy New Year to you. I'm Bill Clifford, President and CEO of the World Affairs Councils of America, and I'm delighted to bring you the kickoff edition of Cover to Cover, our monthly author series, which we've been hosting since January 2014. So we're embarking on our 9th year, and I can't think of a better person or a better topic to begin this year's programming on Cover to Cover than Elizabeth Economy on China. She is currently senior advisor to the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, for China. She's on leave from Stanford University's Hoover Institution, where she's a senior fellow. And previously, she was the C.V. Starr Senior Fellow and Director of Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Her new book is The World According to China, which comes out January 11th, next week. We were delighted to have Liz with us live at our national conference in November, where she was part of a distinguished panel on the geopolitical test of the 21st century. But we've got her solo. And I really want to say and emphasize that Liz is speaking as a scholar and author and not representing the US government in her role as senior advisor to the Commerce Secretary. Right, Liz?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bill. Really great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. And I want to say, again, a warm welcome to the audience joining us for this webinar. We have nearly 150 registered from more than 30 states, including Alaska. There are also attendees from Geneva, Nairobi, Toronto, and Tokyo. You're up very late or very early. That's why we schedule it at 2 o'clock. But Liz, I mean, some of these people are joining Cover to Cover for the first time, and some are coming for seconds because they were at the national conference and didn't get enough of you. But anyway, the world according to China. Let's begin. Today is a solemn day. It's the first year anniversary of the January 6th attacks on the US Capitol by President Trump's supporters. And Newsweek asked the Foreign Ministry of China to comment on the anniversary. The response from a spokesman was, the US must face up to its own democracy deficit instead of trying to promote democracy around the world. I wonder if you would talk about how China's thinking and rhetoric has evolved with respect to the United States, particularly in the last year since the January 6th insurrection.
So thanks again, Bill, for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be part of your kickoff event for 2022. So look, I think it's right for other countries and clearly for the United States itself to look hard at the events of January 6th, to take a step back and to consider what that tells us about the state of our country, of our polity, of our democracy. And I think that Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, when they were in Alaska and met with Yang Jiechi, China's senior foreign policy official, and Wang Yi, the foreign minister, made clear at that point that, you know, one of the things that the United States does and does well typically is to take stock of our own failings and to work hard to improve and to be better. I think in terms of the way that China has looked at January 6th and how it's attempted to use it, you know, it was a gift to the Chinese government. There's no doubt about it. You know, one of the great strengths of the United States as the global superpower has been our defense and our promotion of democracy globally, right? There's the values of democracy are the ones that underpin most of the multilateral institutions that exist today, the international system that was put in place after World War II. And so I think it's been one of our great strengths. So when we take a hit and a big public hit like we did on January 6th, for an authoritarian country like China to be able to say, look at what democracy means in the United States. Is this really the type of country that you want to be following that should serve as a model for other countries? I think, you know, that again, really was an own goal for the United States when it comes to the relationship with China. Having said all that, though, I do want to make one, I think, important point that often goes missed in our discourse and in our sort of self-reflection on January 6th, and that is that China itself is a highly polarized society, and in many respects as polarized as the United States. Across gender lines, across ethnic lines. It is as unequal economically as the United States is, measured by a Gini coefficient. and it has its own war against the creative, intellectual, liberal class that's being waged by ultra nationalists and conservatives. So while I think it's fair to say that we need to do a better job at home, I think we don't want to miss the fact that what's going on in China, even though we can't see it as clearly, is no less as serious, certainly, as what happened here on January 6th.
They are not a monolith.
They're not a monolith, and they are not a model.
And they are not a model. We're going to get to the model. Just sticking with this a moment, Liz, before we get to world order. Ahead of President Biden's Democracy Summit, the Chinese government published a 50-page white paper that basically claimed China's is the democracy that works. What's with their self-confidence and their pride and even this use of language?
I think over the past few years, we've seen repeated attempts by the Chinese to adopt terms of art from the United States and other democracies and just say, with Chinese characteristics. And I think this is another one of those. This is democracy with Chinese characteristics. We've had globalization with Chinese characteristics. I think, what happens, human rights with Chinese characteristics, what happens is it's just a bastardization of the term and of the meaning of the term. And, China is not a democracy in any, classically recognized sense of a democracy. And I've been engaged in a number of discussions now with Chinese scholars and think tank analysts where this issue has come up about why they decided to try to appropriate the term democracy in this way. And I think for most American scholars and analysts, our basic, sense is, listen, you're an authoritarian state, just own it, take pride in it, right? That's what you are. You don't have to try to appropriate democracy. Having said that, the DPRK calls itself a democracy of sorts. But I think, when you see it, it. And in this case, we know that China is not a democracy in the context of having the basic, universal human rights like the freedom of speech. It doesn't have a leadership that is directly accountable to its people through any form of elections. And so none of those basic tenets of democracy are really in place for China. So they can say it, but frankly, as far as I'm concerned, it actually reflects a weakness and a lack of confidence as opposed to a self-confidence.
I remember taking a group of WACA colleagues to China in 2014, and we kept hearing the phrase, not rule of law, rule by law.
There you go.
And yeah, the question that comes from Romer Benitez in Grand Rapids, Michigan is broad, but very appropriate for your book, The World According to China. And that is, what do you see as the emerging world order? The international system, if you will.
Yeah, so I think, let me start a little bit maybe with what China sees, and then I can talk a little bit about what I see, because I think what China sees is really a pretty transformed world order. Transformed in the sense that, China's very geography has changed, right? So that it now incorporates its, the territories that it claims as its sovereign territory, like Taiwan, like the South China Sea, disputed territory with India, Japan, Bhutan, et cetera. It sees itself as the leader in the Asia Pacific region, certainly. It sees its influence spread, both in terms of politics, economics, and security through the Belt and Road Initiative, right, embedded in other countries. I think if we think about countries like the United States or countries in Europe and Japan as having been leaders in infrastructure development, through much of the 20th century, I think China sees itself as the leader in infrastructure development, particularly looking forward for digital infrastructure for the 21st century. And then I think, perhaps, maybe not most importantly, but certainly importantly, Xi Jinping has called for China to lead in the reform of the global governance system. And that means rewriting many of those, norms and rules, again, that have governed the international system in the United Nations and elsewhere for the past 70 years, so that they align with Chinese political values and preferences and sensibilities. So I think that's the vision that China, sees and wants. I would say that, if you were to have asked me this question 3 or 4 years ago, I might have been more concerned that a larger part of China's vision would come to pass. because at that point in time, we had a US leadership that was not interested really in advancing US leadership on the global stage and was leaving a vacuum, right? We had the Trump administration, which was withdrawing from many international agreements. I think President Trump saw US leadership more as a burden, as a responsibility that he didn't really want, believed that the United States had been taken advantage of. And that left a vacuum. And it was a vacuum that I think many people believed China would fill. And China didn't manage to fill it. It didn't step up to lead on issues like climate change. It didn't step up to, establish new agreements around, refugees or to solve the crisis in Myanmar or other countries. Instead, it pursued its own very narrow self-interests, under the guise of global leadership. So looking forward, what do I see? I think we now have a US leadership back in place that is interested again in asserting democratic values, in asserting US leadership in international institutions, wants to be competitive with China, not only as a defensive way, but offering a more proactive and positive vision of what the world can look like moving forward. So I'm a little more optimistic about the United States continuing to be able, along with its allies and partners, to support traditional institutions and norms and resist sort of China's efforts to transform them. On the other hand, I think it's also incumbent, and I think this is an important lesson that we should take away from China's efforts over the past decade. It's important for the US and its allies and partners to adopt a more inclusive vision for the rest of the world. And that means when we sit down to talk about writing new rules around digital currency or whatever it may be, the new technologies that are coming out, AI and ethics, that it can't just be the United States, the EU, and Japan and Australia. It can't just be, even just the G20, that we need to engage more broadly with some of the emerging economies, developing economies in Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia, bring them into this discourse. So I think having more countries at the table as we begin to address the global challenges moving forward is going to be essential. So my vision for what I'd like to see is one where the US continues to lead, but that we do it in a way that moves us beyond our traditional partners and allies and recognizes more of the contributions that need to be made from still developing and emerging economies.
That recalls to my mind the famous phrase articulated by Robert Zoellick, who was then the Deputy Secretary of State for George W. Bush in 2005, when he called on China to be a responsible stakeholder in the system, which is part of that engagement strategy, I guess, that pertained for many years, but reflected China's rising status in the WTO and so forth. Has the US lost interest in China becoming a responsible stakeholder? If you look at the Trumpian contain and confront, and are we a responsible stakeholder?
So let me start with the first part. Have we lost interest? I don't think there's a loss of interest. I think many people would be desperately happy if we could re-engage in that engagement discussion about China, right? So if we could get back to talking about China as a responsible stakeholder, which basically meant that we wanted China to buy into pre-existing norms and institutions and over time, right, not only as an international actor, but domestically, that China would begin to reform and transform, into a market economy and into some form of a democracy. That was always, at least in part, inherent in this idea of engagement and a kind of modernization theory understanding of the trajectory of China's future. I think what has happened is not that there's not any interest in it, but that there's just a complete loss of belief that that's even possible at this point in time. And I think the direction in which Xi Jinping has moved this country is polar opposite to that, right? Not only in terms of his desire to transform international norms and institutions to, again, align with those interests of China, but also domestically, right? Xi Jinping has been much more about party control over the economy, and certainly much more politically repressive than the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao era, his immediate predecessors. And so I don't think there's really any sense at this point that an engagement approach would yield much benefit. And frankly, so in terms of whether we're a responsible stakeholder, obviously over the past 4 years, during the Trump administration, nobody could accuse us of being a responsible stakeholder because we pulled out all our stakes, or we started to pull them all out. So you can't really talk about being responsible when you're basically saying we're not going to, continue to support membership in the World Health Organization in the midst of a global pandemic. I mean, what does that say about US responsibility? That's not to say that there shouldn't be reforms within the United Nations, within the World Health Organization. I think some of what the Trump administration pointed to, what they talked about in terms of challenges in international institutions, certainly were true. And I think were also widely understood by many other countries. But it was the approach that we took that I think meant that we couldn't really call ourselves a responsible stakeholder.
Looking at the two of the biggest crises of this century, the global financial crisis and the pandemic, one before one after Xi Jinping's, during his rule, now nearing its 10th year. Talk about China's, I think China got a lot of credit during the financial crisis. And initially it looked like they were offering a responsible attempt through their diplomacy on vaccines and so forth. But talk about what's different.
So yes, I think in 2008 was the global financial crisis, was actually a good moment for China in many respects, because we had the Olympics, that whole period, right? 2008, 9.
That's true. Two different Olympics too.
Right. You had Beijing's coming out party at the Olympics. You had China stepping up, as you suggest, in the global financial crisis to behave, very responsibly. It did get a lot of credit. Its economy appeared stable. It maintained its role as an engine of economic growth and support globally, and it was very important. There's no two ways about it. I think fast forward, though, to the pandemic, and I think, China's story, the way that it played out, it began badly with the cover up and, sort of what was triggered by the death of Dr. Li Wenliang, and demonstrated that, at least local leaders and then frankly, central leaders also knew more, and they tried to shut down information flowing out to the international community. That was not the way to begin. Then they appeared to be a model for pandemic response, very quickly containing the pandemic. They got a lot of credit for that, despite some of the very harsh measures that they've taken along the way. But then I think where they really lost the narrative was when they took what should have been just a huge diplomatic win in their ability to mass produce, the personal protective equipment, the masks and the gowns and the gloves, and the fact that they had a lot of, over time, the precursors for the vaccines. All of this was important, and they could have played a really positive role, but instead they used it as a sort of coercive bargaining tool, right? And they threatened to hold it, to cut it off if countries didn't thank them, or, in the midst of the pandemic, all of a sudden you see China in this military aggressiveness, in the South China Sea, and the border disputes with India, the first deadly border dispute in 40 years. And you've got China, doing all these sorties, against Taiwan and being aggressive, in the around the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands, even putting pressure in Bhutan. So, even as the world's attention is focused on trying to address this global pandemic, China's trying to take advantage of that for its own personal gain, right? And then, of course, you've got what's going on in Xinjiang, and you've got the suppression of democracy in Hong Kong. So all of these things in a 2-year period, I think, and that wolf warrior diplomacy, I think coalesced to transform, this diplomatic win into a sort of diplomatic debacle for China. And, from my perspective, what really came out of this, I think for China was, or for the international community, was a new understanding of what it would mean to have China as a global leader, and that China really wasn't ready to lead on the global stage in a way where it could suppress its narrow self-interest for the broader global good. And you saw that with regard to Taiwan as well, when they refused to allow Taiwan to participate in briefings from, the World Health Assembly, to participate in those briefings, unless it, came in under, PRC sort of sovereignty terms. So I think much of the PRC's behavior over the course of the pandemic really undermined what could have been a really important step forward in Beijing's ability to demonstrate how it could be a truly great leader for the 21st century.
I want to get specific on the human rights piece that you mentioned in Xinjiang. Is there any likelihood, this is a question, by the way, from Ronan O'Malley of the Houston Council, Greater Houston. Is there any likelihood of the US or any other nations addressing human rights having any impact on Chinese policies? Or is China never likely to bow to any pressure on key domestic issues such as the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, surveillance, and so on?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that the international community's ability to shape China's domestic policy, I think, has diminished over time. It never was that great, it never was that great. I don't think we should look back at some previous period and think that there was some, halcyon moment at which, the US could say, hey, you shouldn't do this, and China didn't do it. And that was never the case. But certainly we've watched over, it's now, almost 5 years since China began this truly repressive policy in Xinjiang of detaining, Uyghur Muslims in these labor and re-education camps, and obviously what happened in Hong Kong. We've tried through economic mechanisms, we've tried through political sanctioning to signal sort of not just the United States, but the broader international community unhappiness with the way that China is conducting its affairs, the way that it's treating its own citizens. It hasn't really had much of an impact, I think. And I don't think that means that we shouldn't still do it. I think it is important to signal. And I think it's important for people in China to know that there are people outside the country who are watching and who are supportive of a more open and more open political system in China. And I think that can give strength to people inside China. So I'm not advocating that we stop what we're doing, but I think it's safe to say that our impact is limited. Having said all that, we don't know what all the debates are internal to China. And so we don't know whether there aren't officials inside China pointing to all the headwinds that this policy in Xinjiang, for example, and Hong Kong, all the headwinds that these policies are generating right now.
Although somebody must have leaked to the New York Times when they did their huge.
There you go.
Yeah.
Right.
So there.
Right. And we do know that there are people who aren't happy with the direction in which Xi Jinping is moving the country in this way. But I also know from my discussions, again, with Chinese scholars, that many of them are afraid now to offer policy recommendations, papers, studies that contradict the direction in which they know the country is already moving, because they feel that there are going to be political reprisals. So that also suggests that the type of information that is actually making its way to Xi Jinping is probably pretty constrained. And I think that's problematic as well.
On that count, I was going to save this question for later, but there are two questions related to how you get information, Liz, from China. One from Ping in Grand Rapids, who asks, how have you been able to stay current on Chinese economic, social, and political situations on the ground in China? And from my colleague, Karina Van Vliet, who heads the Cleveland Council, what's your most reliable Chinese source?
Yeah. So it's most unfortunate. I used to, go to China 3 or 4 times a year, and I'd meet with a wide range of NGO activists and scholars, think tank people, and government officials, business people. So a pretty wide range of people within China, and be able to, put together my own picture based on the ground interviews and engagements of what was going on inside China. I haven't been to China since November of 2019. COVID hit in January of 2020. And so that avenue is basically closed right now. And we don't know when that's going to reopen, really. So how do I do it now? I would say one thing that's happened as a result of the Zoom world is that there are actually many opportunities to engage with Chinese scholars and think tank people and officials via Zoom. And so there are many late night meetings. For whatever reason, they tend to be early morning China time and late night US time, where we talk about primarily international issues, not so much what's going on inside China. But you can begin to get a pretty good flavor over time for what people are thinking about a wide range of foreign policy issues. There are many sort of dialogues underway through various think tanks and universities that you can participate in. So I think that's probably one of my best sources in terms of, engaging actually with Chinese, are through these Zoom kinds of discussions. And I mean, to be frank, many of the people are people that I've known for many years, and they're also people that participate in many of these dialogues. So they tend to be a lot of the same people too, which is not necessarily a good thing. Anyway, that's one important source for me. Are these ongoing dialogues? In terms of other sources of information, I mean, I have in the past relied a lot on Caixin because they tend to give you just a little bit more of an interesting flavor for what's going on inside the country. You might just get a little bit something outside the government line. But basically I rely on things that other people rely on as well. Just basic Chinese news sources, and things like the South China Morning Post, which continues to have some interesting reporting. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I don't have any good secret source at this point, I have to say.
I'd like to move in the next half hour, Liz, to the economy and domestic politics, and then some of the international issues that are on everybody's mind, such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, and also China's rising influence within the Asia Pacific. Talk about the economy, its health, and sort of this is the source of its global influence and power. But as you noted earlier, there's increasing control from Xi's government, and Dawn Samford of Peoria asks, is that higher control actually going to be killing the golden goose?
Yeah. So I think it's a really good question. And I think it's one that the Chinese themselves are concerned about. A lot of Chinese are concerned about this crackdown. So I think there are a number of sort of issues at play when we're thinking about the Chinese economy. First, the Chinese economy continues to grow. I think GDP growth for 2021 is going to be above 6%. So, it's continuing to expand, but it's definitely slower than it's been in the past. China was the only major economy to grow in 2020, and it was 2-point-something%. I can't remember exactly what, 1 or 2.7%. But its growth is slowing, and its productivity growth is slowing, and it's not making the gains in consumption, domestic consumption, that it has wanted. It faced a real estate crisis, and something like 70% of China's personal economic, individuals' economic wealth is tied up in real estate. And so when you have this, real estate crisis underway, where a couple of the major property companies, Evergrande and Kaisa alone, have like $190 billion of debt that it's not clear they're going to repay. You've got, millions of Chinese who've got, money tied up in apartments that have yet to be built. by companies that have no money to move forward on the construction. And construction itself is about 25% of GDP, tied up through the real estate industry is about 25% of China's GDP. That is concerning, certainly, I think, for the Chinese government at this point. There are sort of big, longer term, I think, structural issues that China hasn't yet addressed. I mentioned the inequality, the fact that China has more billionaires than the United States, but has 600 million people living on $150 or $140 a month, is telling. That's pretty incredible for a socialist country. And so that's one of the things that Xi Jinping is trying to rectify with his common prosperity effort. We'll have to see whether he puts in the structural changes necessary to make that work. So far, it seems mostly like wealth transfer. He's called upon a lot of China's wealthiest individuals and the companies basically just to fork over money to become philanthropists in this way. We'll have to see, did the tax system change? Does he get through a property tax really that makes sense, even as they're facing this real estate crisis? There's a lot going on, and it's hard to know exactly how it's all going to play out moving forward. So when I think about the Chinese economy, and I think the other issue, of course, that's getting a lot of attention now is the demographic issue. China has huge problems with its pension system. And they're facing a situation now where, despite having undertaken reform of the one-child system, China can have 2 children, 3 children. They clearly don't want to have more children, and so every year the birth rate has declined. There was a small bump in 2016 or 17, right after they announced the two-child policy, but it continues to decline, the lowest level of births since the founding of the PRC last year. And marriages also have declined every year since Xi Jinping came to power. And interestingly, marriage and, well, even more birth rate correlates with optimism about the economy. And so when you see this playing out this way, you can also get into the mindset of the Chinese people and understand that there's a lot of concern about the future of the economy. Final point I'll make, which I think
Are there?
Go ahead. No, I was going to say.
Are there opportunities for women in the economy?
So, okay, so I'll respond to that in a second. I just want to say one of the other interesting numbers that just came out this December was that unemployment in the 16 to 24-year-old age group, right? So it includes recent college graduates of the technical schools, is at 14.2%. That's very high for a very important demographic, right? So anyway, I think there are a lot of reasons for concern in terms of women's issues and women's access to the economy. It's been one of the striking things under Xi Jinping that women's access to health, to the educational system, to the economy, and to the political system, right? China's relative ranking, right, compared to all the rest of the countries in the world has fallen from 69th to 107th under Xi Jinping. So, think about how China has doubled its income, right, per capita GDP during a little bit more than Xi's tenure. But nonetheless, the role of women and their access to all of this has declined sharply relative to other countries. So women, there's been a lot of discussion about discrimination against women when, because people are worried that they're going to get pregnant. There's discrimination against women in a lot of the tech companies. So there are a lot of challenges, and there's actually a lot of online hate against feminists, and women who say that they don't want to have children, don't want to get married, can be targeted for a lot of online hate. So role of women is fairly challenging. There's only one woman, in the top 25, among the top 25 leaders in China, and not one in the top 7, the standing committee of the Politburo. So in the upper echelons of the Chinese leadership, women are very poorly represented.
Tomonobu Noguchi from Tokyo is asking, how do you think the Chinese government's policy to restrict their major IT companies' activities will play out in terms of slowing future economic growth.
Yeah. So, and this is, I think, one of the surprises, for many people over the past year has been the government's attack on really some of China's, most profitable and globally sort of their big brand names like Alibaba and Tencent and the company ByteDance, which is has as one of its companies TikTok. That China has gone, after these companies. It's gone after, the very profitable and popular sort of online tutoring industry in China, after the gaming industry, video games and things. I think there are a number of reasons behind this. I think Xi Jinping sees these are all areas where you've got flows of money and flows of ideas that increasingly were moving outside of the government's control. And so I think he was fearful about the growing power in these industries to spread ideas and capital in ways that didn't necessarily support the party's interests. I think probably when it comes to some companies like Alibaba, there are personal reasons. When you had someone who had such a high profile like Jack Ma, there can only be one sun god in China, and that sun god is Xi Jinping. It's not going to be Jack Ma. So I think there's probably an element of reining in some of these super high profile tech leaders. And then I do think that there were legitimate concerns around antitrust issues, around monopolies, around potentially some of these technology companies using people's personal information without their permission in ways that they shouldn't have been used. So I think there are a lot of different factors at play. Is it going to affect their ability to prosper and to lead moving forward? I think it can't help but do that. I think when you had a situation where a lot of the best and brightest minds were going into these areas because you could be creative. They were open for entrepreneurialism, and so the world seemed open and exciting for some of the best minds. Now you're basically saying you're putting these people back into a box, a highly constrained box, and a box that could get smaller and smaller, right? Because the government has signaled that they're not willing to allow these areas to expand. So I think the attractiveness for the best and the brightest is going to be limited. But that doesn't necessarily mean that in areas like biotech or autonomous vehicles or other areas of technology that China can't continue to prosper and to lead in innovation. But I think in areas where you've got knowledge transmission, cultural issues at play, all of those areas, I think you're going to see fewer of the best and brightest going into those areas.
I'm going to attempt to combine two related threads, perhaps, into one question. Mary of St. Paul, our Global Minnesota affiliate in St. Paul, Minneapolis, draws on Japan as number one in the 1980s, and there are many big manufacturing companies strutting the world and establishing presences in the United States and elsewhere, and causing people to be fearful of their dominance. Perhaps Chinese companies' brands are less well known to Americans, I'm not sure, but this also relates to Japan also had a big official development assistance thrust. Talk about how Chinese companies and the government through its Belt and Road Initiative kind of use that to raise the centrality of China in the world and what it means for their influence.
Yeah. So Belt and Road Initiative, is really one of Xi Jinping's flagship foreign, probably maybe the flagship foreign policy initiative that he announced in 2013. It began as hard infrastructures, I think everybody knows, with ports and railroads and highways, and it has morphed and evolved to include a digital Silk Road, which is fiber optic cables and e-commerce and satellite systems, surveillance systems. China exports its surveillance systems to countries as well. There's the Health Silk Road that kind of came into into its own during the pandemic. So that's, China exporting medical devices, traditional Chinese medicine, sending out doctors, et cetera. So it's very much, more now. There's a polar silk road too, right, to connect China to Europe more directly. So it's very much more than the original hard infrastructure project of 2013, which had at its heart really, yes, helping to fill the vast infrastructure needs of the international community, but also connecting sort of lesser developed parts of China to global markets more directly, and also spreading Chinese influence. And so, how effective has it been? I think response is mixed. I think at this point in time, we're now, 8 years, moving to 9 years on of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think, certainly Beijing has laid important tracks. I mean, things like fiber optic cables, China's percentage of global fiber optic cable has gone from, 2% to 18%, right? So there's no doubting the impact that it's had. In addition to the physical infrastructure, for example, in the digital Silk Road, China also, where countries are interested, will train them on how to do real-time censorship of the internet, right? Some countries model their internet governance laws after those of China. Not many, but some. It offers, cyber training seminars for Belt and Road countries. So there's a political component to this as well, and then a security component, because China established its first military logistics base in Djibouti as part of the Belt and Road as well. And there are going to be more bases to come. Certainly, I think Cambodia is going to be next up. So there's no doubt that it has, cemented Chinese presence in many countries in ways that it wasn't there previously.
I was going to ask you, where regionally have they had the most success? Because originally it was focused on Central Asia and the parallel with the traditional Silk Road, but we have Belinda in Alaska asking if it's Africa or other regions where they've been able to penetrate better, and what the American response should be.
So it's a really interesting. I mean, to begin with, the Belt and Road actually did go all the way to Africa. There were 6 corridors that were originally sketched out that connected China through to the rest of Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and 3 overland and 3 maritime routes. So it always did go to Africa. But over time now, there are like 130 countries that have some form of a memorandum of understanding. Doesn't mean they have any investment, Belt and Road investment, but they are somehow have said we'd be interested in participating in this grand scale plan. Where they have most influence, I think, is an interesting question, because where they have the biggest presence doesn't necessarily give them the greatest influence, right? Because one of the things you find is that in a lot of Belt and Road countries, you will have a lot of popular protests, a lot of social unrest surrounding Belt and Road projects, because oftentimes the environmental standards are poor. They don't use local labor, or they use primarily Chinese labor for the construction, which, means that the local population isn't really receiving the benefits necessarily of this, infrastructure. Sometimes you have situations where new leaders come into countries and recognize that the terms that were struck in the original Belt and Road negotiations are not very favorable to the host country. Maybe there was some corruption underpinning those original agreements. So it's hard to say that that actual investment translates directly into positive influence. Because when you think about influence, you think of it in terms of positive influence, I think. One of the things I discovered, honestly, in researching my book is if you look at the 5 countries where that have received the greatest amount of Belt and Road investment, you'll find that they don't necessarily support, those countries don't necessarily support China on political issues that are important to China. So when there are resolutions in the United Nations, for example, to criticize China around something like the South China Sea or Xinjiang or Hong Kong, China can't count on those countries where it's the most in Belt and Road investment to support it on all of those issues. Sometimes they do, like maybe Pakistan, but sometimes in other cases on some issues they don't, like Indonesia, for example. So it's just interesting when we're talking about influence to try to understand how we would measure that. The last point I would make is that I think if you look at popular opinion polls globally, you would be surprised to see, for example, pretty vast differences in the ways that different countries within one continent might respond to Chinese Belt and Road investment, or might see China. Overall, what you see is that levels of trust in Xi Jinping and levels of support for China as a leading country are at an all-time low, right, across continents. So I think, it's one of the interesting things is that we think of something like the Belt and Road as automatically translating into greater influence, greater positive influence for China. It's not necessarily the case.
You can't really comment on the US response, can you? Because it comes largely from the Commerce Department.
No. The U.S. response for Belt and Road is really the Build Back Better World,
Yeah.
I think, which is largely being run out of the State Department.
Okay.
And in partnership with many different countries, and I think is just getting ginned up. We'll have to wait to see. But to that point, I think it's useful to note that, for example, Japan, which one of the questioners earlier raised, is a larger source of infrastructure investment in Southeast Asia than China is. So again, sometimes we don't even really know we don't actually have the real data, because the media, frankly, tends to hype everything that China does.
Yes.
Right? And the Japan story is a much quieter one. Japan isn't out there making a lot of proclamations about its global infrastructure leadership. But it is a larger source of investment in Southeast Asia, and
the quality and financing is often better too.
Exactly, that's also the case. So yeah.
Talking about media hype, we have a number of questions on Taiwan, which is starting to rightly gather attention in the news media, but it can be frightening. Kathy of Hilton Head and William of Grand Rapids ask essentially the same questions. What steps can the Biden administration take, along with our allies, that's important, to convince China not to attack Taiwan, if it in fact is thinking of attacking Taiwan?
Yeah. So this issue of whether or not Beijing is planning to launch a military attack against Taiwan is one that is much debated among US analysts, and there really isn't a consensus. I would say that, the fact that Xi Jinping says there can be no great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation without reunification with Taiwan should signal to us that the issue of Taiwan is of paramount importance to Beijing and to Xi Jinping himself, and that we need to be very careful about how we think about supporting Taiwan. The story of Taiwan is a great one, right? It's a vibrant democracy. It's a real success story of a democratic transition from an authoritarian state. Had its first elections, competitive elections, less than 30 years ago. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's a very successful economy, and it was a model for COVID response. And so I think there's a lot of interest now from a lot of countries in engaging more deeply with Taiwan, right? Diplomatically, economically. It's an attractive nation, and so why not? But that other part of the story is China, mainland China, and its sovereignty claims over Taiwan. And so how do you help Taiwan develop an effective deterrent, right? So what are the steps that the United States and its allies and partners can take that support Taiwan without provoking Beijing to rash action, especially as Beijing's military continues to expand and to become much stronger? We have to be ever more thoughtful about this. And so for me, I tend to think in terms of trying to ensure that whatever political action we're taking, or economic action that's designed to bolster Taiwan's standing in some respect, right? Supporting Taiwan's membership in the World Health Organization, or bringing Taiwan into some kind of regional economic framework or effort, in the Indo-Pacific. Whatever it is that we're doing needs to be matched by an effort to bolster their actual security, their physical security. So ensuring that Taiwan is upgrading its, missile defense system adequately, ensuring that Taiwan's military, that its reserve forces are, properly trained and ready to take action, I think that there's concern around this particular issue. And not taking actions on the part of the US and other countries that are unnecessarily provocative, right? Because the truth is, Taiwan is, in my opinion, it's a very attractive nation, right? And you want to help them and you want to support them, but you don't want to do it in a way that is going to trigger something in Beijing. And so I think everything that we do has to be done against a backdrop of ensuring that we are truly enhancing Taiwan's security and bolstering a deterrent, and not simply taking what we might consider to be feel-good actions that do nothing except provoke Beijing. So it's a very fine line that we have to walk.
Well, to that point, my colleague Pat Ryan of the Tennessee World Affairs Council asks, what should concerned Americans make of the deliberately ambiguous US commitment to the defense of Taiwan? And Janet in Newton, I think Massachusetts, asks, how might the US defend Taiwan if it is in fact attacked?
Yeah. So, I mean, the sort of the ambiguity, strategic ambiguity has been the US policy since 1979, basically. And we had the Taiwan Relations Act, which does not commit us to come to the defense of Taiwan. It's not an alliance treaty of some sort, but it does commit us to provide the military support, so provide arms to Taiwan so that it can defend itself. So to provide for Taiwan to adequately defend itself. So I think that's the first thing that we need to do, is to continue with our arms sales as we have, in ways that, again, help to bolster Taiwan's self-defense capabilities. What's happened over the past 6 months that is quite new and striking has been that, this issue of Taiwan and Taiwan's defense has been almost uniquely a US concern outside of Taiwan and mainland China. Really, the United States has been the only significant actor engaged in this kind of discussion. But you've now had both Australia step up and indicate that it would, if the US became militarily engaged in a conflict around Taiwan, that Australia would step up, and Japan at least indicate that it takes Taiwan's security as sort of integrally tied to its own security. So these are important new developments in the sort of the military framing around Taiwan. I think, good.
Well, I was going to say, interestingly, some smaller nations are getting caught up in this, not even close to the region really, but for some curious reasons. Nancy Hamlin of Rochester, New York, asks, what do you make of the recent news regarding China's lashing out at Lithuania over Taiwan?
I know. Well, yes. So Lithuania has upgraded its economic office in Taiwan, giving it a name that mainland China doesn't approve of, and has refused to be bullied by China, and has pulled out of the Belt and Road initiative, out of the 17+1 framework, which was the way that China approached the nations of Central and Southern Europe with the Belt and Road. So Lithuania has taken this very strong stand, but other countries have as well. The Czech Republic has also stood up, has sent senior officials to Taiwan. One of them even repeated something like, I am a Taiwanese, or something like that, back reminiscent of, ich bin ein Berliner. But there are these moments now with some of the smaller nations standing up in defense of Taiwan, I think largely on human rights and democracy grounds, and a kind of appreciation for, their own history and what it felt like to be subjugated by a greater, larger sort of, authoritarian, totalitarian power, in their case, the Soviet Union. And so I think there's a sense in some of these countries that they recognize Taiwan in themselves, and they want to be supportive of Taiwan on these grounds. And I think that's also threatening to Beijing in a different way than the United States is. And then, frankly, you've got countries like France and the UK that are starting to send ships, mostly to South China Sea, but have a newfound interest in security engagement in the Indo-Pacific in ways that also are frustrating to Beijing, because it used to be that Europe was only concerned with the trade and investment and making money, and now all of a sudden you have NATO, and you've got these other countries beginning to say, actually, Indo-Pacific security is a European priority as well.
We've got so many more questions than the time would allow us to get into, but I'm going to go to Jack in Traverse City on nuclear weapons, and then Dan Krasenstein in LA on cooperation. Jack asks, China has long had a minimum deterrence nuclear strategy. Do you think that has changed, or is a normal modernization underway?
Yeah, so China is now moving aggressively to build up its nuclear capabilities in a way I think that many people in the US have found surprising. Do I think it's normal? I think it's part of China's overall belief that it is, if not already on par with the United States, it is shortly to be on par, and that this nuclear capability is one measure of this parity with the United States, and it's no longer willing to have such a vast gap between the US nuclear capability and that of China.
Okay, and Dan Krasenstein asks, please name 5 areas where the US and China can realistically cooperate. After all, it's been so much confrontation, but there have been constructive actions. The rejection of China as a responsible stakeholder kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But what are areas that there's reasonable chance, big areas for cooperation between our countries?
Yeah, so I think clearly climate change is an area where there's already cooperation. I think moving forward, infrastructure, global infrastructure development is an area where we ought to be able to cooperate. It would be great if we could cooperate around issues like Myanmar, certainly around refugees. That should be an area that has some mutual interest. That's 3. Okay, 4. Macroeconomic strategy, I think, is one where I think the Treasury Department already and the Chinese have some constructive dialogues underway. Now I need a 5th. Well, I'd love to say
future pandemic.
I can't even go there. I mean, I'd love to say global fisheries, I think is a really important one where the Chinese are not doing what they should be doing. That would be a great area if we could find some stronger areas of cooperation. I think that would be a good one.
Well, to the many friends and colleagues whose questions I was not able to pull into this conversation, you will find answers in The World According to China. Liz, congratulations. Is this your 4th or so book? It's at least 4. It comes out January 11. You want to get a copy. You also should try to invite Liz to your council because you've seen how great she is. Thank you so much for joining us, Liz, for Cover to Cover, and really good luck to you this year.
Thanks so much, Bill. It's been terrific. And thanks to everybody for such a great set of questions.